We've been trained to think of time as a one-way street. Once a second passes, it's gone. But for thousands of years, humans have acted like that isn't true. From ancient civilizations describing time slowing down, to a modern-day physicist who spent his entire life building a machine to try and see his father one more time.
I was devastated. I thought if I could build a time machine that I could go back and see him again and tell him what was going to happen.
Deep down inside, people have always believed there is a way back.
What did I tell you?
Why is that? Why have we always believed we could travel through time?
Stories as H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds and Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea have challenged mankind. So today, man is successfully probing deep into the mysteries of the universe. Can he penetrate the greatest mystery of all, time itself?
I've been going over the data for days, and the more that I look at the science of how the stars and the aurora actually work, the more I realize that it's easy to get locked into the rules of it all. From the oldest ancient stories to the most advanced physics labs, we've always believed that there were rules to the universe, especially when it comes to time. We've also believed that there was a way to move through time beyond those set societal rules. Is this just a fantasy we use to deal with loss or regret, or is time travel an ancient human capability we've simply forgotten how to use? To find out, let's follow some specific leads. The scientist who spent his life building a time machine. The glitch, a street where the past supposedly leaks into the present. Lucid dreamers who say they can travel through time in their dreams. And the philosophy that says that the past actually never left us. Time has been something people have been trying to solve since the beginning. I'm not a scientist or physicist. I'm just a journalist. And quite frankly, that is all past my pay grade. But for my research for this story, something that is dead clear is that people, we humans, do not truly grasp what actually time is. So we tell stories and make analogies, create clocks and sundials to try to understand what we can, but strip down all of the technology and just look up. Let's talk to Tom Kerss, who is one of the world's leading astronomers specializing in aurora borealis. So he can explain better than I can that the stars we see every night are actually windows into the past.
Point out here the observatory. The frame of the universe beyond is so big and so far away. So there is ancient light reaching you. But there's even more time scales that are strange to think about, like the energy from the sun. It might take only 8 minutes to get from the sun to the earth, but it takes about 150,000 years to get from the core of the sun to the surface of the sun.
So if we can see the past by looking up, why can't we get to it? Why can't we touch it, walk into it? Now, it's not like a crazy question, you know. If you follow the logic, you get to this question, a question that people have been asking since forever. I've pulled a clip from one of the world's leading theoretical physicists, Brian Greene's talk, where he confirms this question of the clock we all live by.
We say that time has elapsed. We notice that because things now are different from how they were a little while ago. That's what we mean by time elapsing. But is time some fundamental quality of reality, or is it something that our brains impose on our perceptions to organize our experience into some coherent framework that allows us to survive?
Okay, so it seems like we need to reframe our concept of time, not as a ticking clock, but as an invisible fabric, like a giant trampoline. In fact, this is the concept that German-born theoretical physicist Albert Einstein realized, that space and time are actually the same thing, woven together into one big sheet called space-time. When something big and heavy like a star sits on this fabric, it causes it to bend and curve.
Time travel is absolutely possible, and this is not some sort of weird sci-fi thing that I'm talking about here. Albert Einstein taught us more than 100 years ago that time travel is possible if you're focusing upon time travel to the future.
Okay, now stick with me because I know it does get a little bit sciencey here. But because of this theory from Einstein that most of the world now agrees upon, space-time can also be warped into a loop. So that idea of time is linear, the past, the present, and the future, the idea that we've been trained on, might actually be a circle. And if it is a circle, someone was bound to try and build a doorway through it.
Back to the future. Could it actually happen with a real time machine?
Let's talk about this guy, Dr. Ronald Mallett, physicist, professor emeritus at the University of Connecticut, one of the first African Americans to earn a PhD in theoretical physics. He's been on CNN, in textbooks, in the labs, and for most of his career, no one really knew what he was working on.
First, I have to point out that all of my work is based on Einstein's work. That's the only reason why I or my colleagues take it seriously. Okay, the root of it is that Einstein's theory not only can matter create gravity, but light itself can create gravity.
So that's the foundation. Light creates gravity, gravity warps time, connect the dots, and you get something extraordinary.
What I was able to show is that by using a special type of laser beam, it's called a circulating laser beam, and a device, there's an actual real device that can create this beam of light because it's circulating. It's called a ring laser. And a ring laser can create a circulating beam of light. And what I was able to show mathematically again is that by solving Einstein's equations, that a circulating beam of laser light can actually cause a twisting of space and time. That is to say, time normally flows from the past to the present to the future. And all of us go along this timeline throughout our entire life, okay? But now suppose that there was a way, and I found a way, that you could actually twist that timeline into a loop. Then you could go from the past to the present to the future, but I've created a loop so I can go from the future to where? Back to the past.
But why? Why does a world-class physicist spend his entire career and his life chasing this? The answer lives in the Bronx in 1955.
And he died suddenly of a massive heart attack. I was only 10 years old, and he was only 33 years old. And for me, it was like Superman, dying. It's just like it couldn't happen. And I was devastated. To say that I became depressed. Before that, I was actually just a happy kid. And about a year after he died, when I was about 11, I came across the book, and it was actually an illustrated version. It was called The Time Machine, Classics Illustrated. Okay? Yeah. And this changed my life. It really did. Because when I saw it, I thought this said, it just spoke to me when I saw it. But then when I opened it up and I read what it said scientific people know very well that time is a kind of space, and we can move forward and backward in time just as we can in space. And I said, wait a minute, if we can move forward and backward in time, that means that if I had a time machine, I could go back into the past and see him again and maybe save his life.
He spent the next 6 decades chasing just that, and he had to hide this truth about himself and his passion. Through his time in the Air Force, through college, undergrad, through his PhD at Penn State, he tied it to what the science world accepted as legitimate science, black holes and things like that, even though his theory was also backed through Einstein's work. But Dr. Mallett had to hide it, the time travel stuff. Also, no one would know what he really was after, and so that no one called him crazy.
And I went through the normal track until I got tenure, and I became a full professor. And then I knew I was safe, and I was able to come out of the time travel closet, so to speak, okay?
His early 2000s papers got the world's attention, and the original dream, a machine that could send a human back or forward in time, that's evolved. Here's where he stands today.
It would be really jazzy to be able to, say we're going to send a human being back. But, we call this the information age. And that's, in fact, what we would be able to do. We would be able to send information back. And in some ways, that's even more important than sending a human being back. Now, imagine if we could have sent information back, for instance, medical knowledge about COVID before it happened, and the millions of lives that would have saved. Or let's suppose that we could send information back about tsunamis, earthquakes.
So there's a pivot. An evolution in Dr. Mallett's time travel theory. It's not the classic version of a person stepping into a machine, but it's data, a warning, a message, which sounds abstract until he tells you about a letter that he received from Germany.
This couple, this man and woman, were probably the parents of this young woman. okay? The next picture was a picture of the woman by herself, okay? The next picture was a car that was totally mangled. The last picture, which was the heartbreaking picture, they actually had sent me a picture of her in her coffin. And so I could pick up the essence of what this was saying even before I got the translation. And in fact, once I got the translation, this was the father who had sent me this. And what he was asking was the fact that if it was possible to send information back to them, to tell them, don't go out that night.
That is why this matters. It's not science fiction. It's every person who has ever lost someone and thought, what if I could have just said something to warn them? While Dr. Mallett is in the lab trying to twist light to reach the past, some people believe that the past is already leaking through the cracks of reality. They call them time slips, and there is one documented place where people keep reporting these weird incidences, and it's called Bold Street in Liverpool, England. Bold Street is a busy shopping area in the heart of Liverpool. To a tourist, it looks normal, cool vibes. But for decades, it's been the epicenter of stories that defy the laws of physics. The most famous case happened in 1996. A man named Frank was shopping with his wife when he went into Dylan's bookstore, which is now called Waterstones, and Frank wandered off to look for a record store. But when he turned the corner, the world changed. The pavement turned into a road, the modern cars turned into 1950s vans, and the bookstore where he just left his wife, it was gone. Well, there's a local writer named Tom Sleman, and he's known for writing about mysteries. And in 1997, he was contacted by this Frank guy. In Sleman's book, Haunted Liverpool, he says, I get asked about this case all the time. Frank was terrified. He tried to enter the store, but he was stopped by a young man in 1950s clothes who told him it was no longer a bookstore. Within seconds, the world snapped back, the cars vanished, the bookstore reappeared, and Frank was back in 1996. This is the tension of the whole story I'm trying to share with you guys. On one hand, we have scientists like Brian Greene saying time loops are theoretically possible according to math. And on the other hand, you have people on this street in Liverpool claiming it's physically happening to them. Now, friends, the Bold Street story goes on. It's one of the wildest rabbit holes you can dive down because there's another witness to Frank's account. Now identified as Julie French, but in Sleman's book, she's called Emma, and she's done interviews with the BBC. Now, by most accounts, this Bold Street story is considered credible, but we'll not veer off into this path. Rather, we'll stick with the specific journey in time travel and ask, is Bold Street a geographical glitch, or is it proof that the one-way street of time, like most of us believe, is a lot more complicated than we can handle? Can I share a quick story about an experience that I had? It was the moment where I seemed to warp time. That's the best way I could describe it. This was the first time where I actually felt that time wasn't real, at least in the way that we understand it. Okay, so I was in Alaska on a tour with my buddy. We were walking around Fairbanks, Alaska, having a great day, and I remember there was plenty of time before we had to go back to the bus before we had to leave. So we went to one more store. It was a JCPenney, and I remember remarking about like nostalgic it was to see it. When's the last time we saw a JCPenney? So I was curious what a JCPenney in Alaska would have. I was surprised because they had some really cute swimsuits and it was a good price. So me and my buddy were trying on clothes, and suddenly we had 15 minutes to get back to the bus, but we couldn't leave these great swimsuits behind. So also we looked at the line where you needed to purchase, and it was moving slowly because the people who were in line when we went to try on the swimsuits were still in line, and there was only a handful of them. We're not going to leave these swimsuits behind in Alaska. We're going to take them because they were a good find. We made the call to buy the swimwear very anxiously. Now that line moved slow, and so did apparently the time. I mean, every time I looked down at my watch, only like 1 or 2 minutes passed. But when we left the store, we had 5 minutes, a good 5 minutes, and we were about 7 blocks away from the bus. So here we are, we're just trying to book it down to the bus, out of shape, but we're running, walking. Well, here's the time trick that happened. By the time we were 3 blocks away, we saw others who were a part of our group just casually walking to the bus, almost looking at us strangely, like, girls, why are you running? But then when we got on the bus, sat in our seats, still anxious because of everything that we went through, We weren't even the last ones on the bus. I looked down at my watch and we still had 2 minutes to spare. That's when I looked at my friend and I was like, I think we just warped time. What happened? And she said, yes, I've been telling you, time is a social construct. Well, we laughed at that because she's one of those people who are often late. And so she's used that before. But that day, it was our reality. You know, being on a cruise ship for the past week and then being here at the airport is a direct real life contrast to how time works. Out on the sea, time kind of feels like a loop, almost irrelevant, especially as a passenger. The sun is rising and setting. Those were the markers. I ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner when I wanted to, not really guided by time. And now here at the airport, time is super important. There are schedules, everybody and everything is guided by it. Because that system, that airport schedule, is exactly what we've been taught to perceive as the only reality. What if Ronald Mallett didn't actually need a machine? And what if the time slips, like we saw in Liverpool, aren't glitches in the Earth's crust, but glitches in how we've been taught to perceive reality? These stories, these examples that we've gone through are modern cases. Dr. Mallett, Bold Street. But what do indigenous people think? What did the ancient people think? Well, there is a record of this through the Aboriginal Australian Everywhen. The term was coined by anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner in 1953 to describe the Aboriginal Australian dreaming. It isn't a story of the past, it's a narrative of experience that encompasses the past, present, and a charter for future events. Now check out this clip from this lecture at Harvard where curator Stephen Gilchrist explains how the exhibit he presented shows Indigenous Aboriginal art representing a layered relationship to time.
The exhibition isn't merely about time, it is also about power and who gets to claim time, history, place, cultural memory.
The Everywhen frames time as more of a landscape versus a road. That past isn't behind you, it's just a different part of the ground you're standing on. If time is a landscape, then 1950 and 2026 are just two different hills of the same valley. You don't travel to them, you just change where you're looking. I found this exact same logic thousands of miles away from indigenous people in the Arctic. The Sami people. They are one of Europe's indigenous groups inhabiting Sapmi, a region stretching across northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia's Kola Peninsula. With a history dating back more than 4,000 years, they are traditionally reindeer herders, fishermen, and hunters who survived by reading the sky. Now, on a recent trip to the Arctic, I spoke with a shaman named Ronald who explained.
If you're getting lost in the forest or in the nature and you can see the stars, then you know where the north is because you know this special star.
To the Sami, the stars aren't just distant lights. It's called the nail of the north. It's their anchor for the entire world. In their culture, you don't use a clock to tell time. You use the relationship between the earth and the sky. It's also the connection they have to their ancestors. And that connection is happening now. And it's in the form of northern lights. Get it? The people who died are dancing right above them every night in real time. You don't whistle at the northern lights because you're not looking at a light show. You respect the northern lights because you're looking at a layer of reality where the dead are still alive. But wait, that phrase my friend used, that time is a social construct, from what we've learned so far, she's kind of onto something. Time just might be something our brains invent to keep us from experiencing everything all at once. And so it follows that possibly the most powerful time machine ever built is right here. In particular, when we're asleep, think about it. When we sleep, the rules of time totally disappear. You can visit your childhood home, you can talk to people who aren't here anymore, you can live an entire day in what actually is a 20-minute nap. And there are people who say they have figured out how to take control of what happens and where they go in their dreams. And they are called lucid dreamers. This is Dr. Denholm Adventure-Heart. He's one of the world's leading researchers in the science of lucid dreaming. He's spent years studying how we can wake up inside of our dreams and take control.
And what I have found is that many people report the same thing that you've just said, that time feels condensed or compressed so that there's more experience within the dream. Now, there's a few theories as to why that might be. From my experience and the experience of many lucid dreamers, usually when you're in a dream, time perception matches up with linear sort of waking lifetime perception. And there's even some experiments that have investigated this. One study I know of where they asked people to, in a dream, to count to 10 and then do what's called an eye signal, which is a technique that allows the lucid dreamer to communicate to someone studying them in a laboratory setting. And it's as simple as moving the eyes left, right. And the reason it works is because within our dreams, our eye movements actually correspond to what we're looking at within the dream. So this technique allows scientists to monitor the eyes, and they've asked lucid dreamers to do an eye signal, then count 1001, 1002, 1003, etc., up to 10, and then do another eye signal. And in this kind of study, even though it's a small amount of time, only 10 seconds, it's been shown that, at least for that, it did take about the same amount of time in waking life for them to do this procedure within the dream.
So the science says that the clock doesn't actually stop when we close our eyes. That's the science. But then there are cases that science can't explain.
But then we get all these fascinating exception cases where people report that they have enormous amounts of experiences that don't seem possible to fit within the amount of time they've actually been dreaming. And so one great theory for this is that, in a sense, it can be a little bit like what happens in a movie. So when you're watching a movie, it can span much more time than the length of the actual movie. Let's say the movie goes for 2 hours or so, but as it's going, you're seeing scene by scene, and there's cuts and transitions, and the same can happen in dreams. So this is one explanation for why sometimes it might feel like you've had a lot more dream experience than you actually have.
And then there's the case he put in his PhD, the one that broke the movie theory entirely.
But then we get the really interesting reports. They reported that in the dream, started with an accident, they woke up, they dreamt of waking up in a hospital, and their gender was now female, which was very, very bizarre. So that male in waking life, they woke up as a female. They said that they remembered going through the recovery process in hospital, then getting out, eventually doing a degree in chemistry, getting a job at a pharmaceutical company. They report not only just scene by scene, but they were very, very explicit in saying that they remember all the mundane things too, like going to the bathroom and changing a broken light bulb and reading the newspaper, not just the kind of cuts you get in a movie. And then not only that, they met a husband, and then they had children. And then the dream ended with them driving a car, had an accident, I think they crashed into a tree, and then had a real awakening and found themselves back as a teenage male, thinking about this incredible experience they'd had. And they said that years later, when they'd actually written out this description and posted it online, they said that even to this day, they still feel grief for the children that they had within this dream.
That grief is real. The children weren't. And science has no explanation for how an entire life fit inside of a single night.
The jury's out. At least some of the time, our dreams are not really time traveling. They're just the brain remodeling reality for various reasons. Is that time traveling? I don't know. It certainly felt like it to them.
So where does that leave us? We've spent this entire journey looking for where or a how, a time machine, a glitch, a portal, but maybe the reason we haven't solved time travel, or why no one in history who has ever tried has truly succeeded, is because we're not actually meant to understand it. I think it's too big. It's beyond our comprehension. So will we humans ever stop trying? Probably not. We're wired to want to go back. We're wired to want to see people we've lost. And now that you've been on this journey with me, go to sleep tonight and you let me know where you went in the morning.